Welcome to Distorted Opinions. I'm Kayla, and as always, I'm with Matt and Ted. And guys, it's time for our monthly gear talk. And this month, we're going to talk about something that the three of us have been talking. We'll have our gear talk jingle, which is the giveaway that this is a gear talk and not a regular show. So we're going to talk about amps, which is something that the three of us have been talking about a bit for a while now, kind of through text messages and stuff. And mostly, I think, starting around that buyout of Mesa Boogie by Gibson, which we're not going to focus on that so much today, but that was kind of an interesting situation. So, we're going to start with Matt, because I know Matt's on a time crunch and there's a chance he may have to drop out here, but
I don't want to.
He's unfortunately he's got some place to be today.
Priorities, man.
I know. I'm a dad too.
Wah, wah, wah.
Parenting 101.
That's a different podcast.
It is.
So that's all right. This is a music podcast. So today we're going to be, I think, focusing mostly on tube amps, but there's other types of amps as well. There's solid state amps, and then I actually didn't realize there was such a thing as hybrid amps until I was looking up my notes for this show, which is a combination of tube amps and solid state amps. And then you have digital or modeling amps, which are there's really no physical hardware. It's pretty much a computer-based interface. So I can't speak too much to digital amps or hybrid amps, so I don't know if either one of you know much about those, that you plan to talk about them, but I think we're going to focus mostly on tube amps and solid state amps. And we'll start with Matt's got a tube amp that he's going to talk about today. And if you're watching the video version, that's behind him. And so, Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about that amp?
Yes.
All right.
Okay, so
you nailed it.
Okay, that was short. Moving along.
That's an amp. Okay, so Ted, no, I'm just kidding. So yeah, today's primary topic that we're going to talk about, just like what Kayla said, we're going to talk about more basically on solid states and tube amps. What's the difference? The amp that I have behind me is what's called a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe. Now, for those that are familiar with the Hot Rod Deluxes, there's several generations of them. Don't quote me, but I believe that they are on a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe 4, similar to the digitalized version of what's in series wise a Fender Mustang. But with this one, I would say this is the first generation. I've had this amp for a while. Ted, you've seen this amp, in the years to come and whatnot.
Plenty of jams.
Plenty of shows. This is a tube amp and whatnot. So a little bit of history with this amp and whatnot. So it's so as I mentioned, it's a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe and whatnot. It's got similar glassy, clean tones. That are very similar, that are very affectionate to if those that are using a pedal board. It has two drive channels, one that's got a blues driver to it. So for those that are familiar with, a blues driver, say like a Boss pedal, has that type of channel to it, as well as a regular another input for more grungier tones for that rock and roll elements and whatnot. So this amp contains 12 AX7 pre-tube amps. I have yet to ever replace these amps, which, thankfully I don't have to, but I'm sure at one point in time there's going to have to be a change in tubes and whatnot. It's always been informed that if you're going to change your tubes, always go to your nearest guitar place to go ahead and get changed out, because you could not only destroy the tubes, but you could also mess your amp up as well. So for those that are thinking about changing your tubes, get it professionally done. The power tubes are 5881 power tubes. So that way it creates that clean tones and whatnot. And inside it also has a 12-inch Fender Eminence driver, which will allow those tones to go unnoticed as well. So the type of tube power that it uses 40 watts. You don't let the number fool you. It is loud. as I mentioned, as a little joke, parenting 101, as a dad, I can't even put this to 1 without waking my son up and whatnot. So it just goes to show that even
Your son's a light sleeper.
Yes. Fair.
Sorry.
It will. I've yet to ever put the amp past 5. So.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I feel you on that.
It's pretty loud. It's pretty loud and whatnot. I don't want to take that chance on ever putting it out to 5 unless I was playing outside and whatnot. But brought it to playing jams, and even our jam sessions, probably no more than 2, compared to all the other amps and whatnot. So 40 watts, it definitely kicks enough power to go ahead and do some damage if you need to. It's got that Fender clean tone, has a spring reverb attached to it as well, has 3 types of channels. It has a clean, it has a drive, and it has a more drive. So as I was mentioning before, it has that blues driver type of element, and then it's got another natural overdrive as well. It is all tubed, and it also, when this came with it came with a pad dust cover, but for some reason I was unable to find it. But normally it would have it. This Fender Hot Rod Deluxe also comes with a extra cab that matches it as well. So if you want to have 2 12-inch speakers to go ahead and power, you could have double the amount. So you could have 80 watts of power. Might as well just play in a friggin' arena. Other than that, this was my first tube amp right here.
Where did you buy it?
It was actually a gift.
Oh, nice.
So, after my solid state, which, Kayla will talk about, difference between solid states and tubes, is one main element is with tube amps, not tube ants.
Oh, 2 different things.
There's no such thing as tube ants unless you find an amp that's a tube. But hey, you have to let the tubes warm up because that's what creates the sound. Other than that, it's, as mentioned, it was a gift from my parents. And ever since really being experienced to tube amps, really haven't gone back. I mean, I experimented a little more with digitalized amps. I feel like today's industry is using a lot of digitalized amps only because of the tone and tonalities. Plus, it's also easier to go ahead and record as well. It brings the mixing and the mastering elements a little more dynamic versus having, say, like a excuse me, SM57, attached to an amp. It's if you're going to be recording amps, still use them. I mean, the SM57 is definitely industry, wide, still being used to today. The SM58 is still being utilized for those that are vocalizing. But you can't go wrong with mic and an amp. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, for those that are interested in recording amps and whatnot, take a shot at it, try to do so. But that's pretty much it. I only had that one amp I want to talk about, for our short segment today. Only because I haven't really experienced, to be honest, with other amps, except for a Marshall solid state, which that was back in high school years. And then, of course, as rock guitar players and whatnot, eventually someone has a half stack in their life at one point. As great as it is for imagery, it sucks carrying it. Yeah. Oh my gosh, it sucked. And don't even get me started on full stacks. But if you notice today, when concerts were happening, because we're still a little bit of a pandemic aspect, even rock and roll players out there, they're not utilizing those full stacks anymore. What are they using? They're using something similar to this. Why? Because everything could be mic'd. Mm-hmm. So the technology has not only advanced, but the usage of amps is now just for imagery. So get a little bit of a... Oh, yeah.
For real quick, I believe it was the last tour Rush went on. Geddy Lee actually didn't have amps at all. I believe he went straight through the PA system of the arenas that they played in. And so in place of amps, he had a functioning dryer and washer set behind him
Oh, that's
that I
amazing.
think had Rush t-shirts going through it. And I'm not sure if they threw those out at the show. But I mean, just to kind of piggyback on Matt's comment, I mean, there are people not even using amps period in their setup. Larger bands, I'm not sure if you're a small local band that you can necessarily get away with relying on the PA system of a local club as your source for your your amplification on your bass or your guitar. But just something I always thought was interesting was that he replaced the amps with the washer and dryer set.
Well,
That
I'll tell you this: the last gig I played,
You brought a washer and dryer?
no, they brought a steak and cheese sandwich. No, I'm just kidding. No, they used a MacBook. Their amp went same type of aspect. They connected their MacBook to the PA, and they used, I believe, like amplitude or something like that as their amp, and they played the show just like that.
Well,
don't know how much.
I mean, a couple of thoughts on the digital amp, because we've certainly seen a lot of promotion, like Gojira working with Neural company
Neural
with their
DSP.
own digital amp, so you can get like the Gojira sound, which is cool. But it's nice. I get it. Like, you don't want to need. It's less to carry. As a guitar player, you just stroll in with your guitar in case, and that's it. Maybe whatever cord you need just to plug into a laptop, which is so much smaller and lighter, more manageable than an actual amp. However, but let's remember about the conversation we had with
Joda
the Ritualist when they were talking.
Oh, was it Ritualist?
I think it was Ritualist.
I think it was.
Okay.
They were saying that they were at a show and a band that was performing with them had taken all their audio to go through a laptop with digital amps, and the laptop crashed.
Yeah.
Or
And then there was no music because you relied solely on the digital aspect. And I mean, odds of that happening during a show, during a gig, right before, fairly small. Technology is fairly reliable, but the fact that it could happen, I mean, I know it's, utilizing modern technology to solve a logistical problem, but at the same time, just having an amp. I mean, for the most part, amps are fairly reliable, unless you're like blowing a tube or something in terms of a tube amp. So then solid state gets the win because, the tones are different. Tube amps are warmer in tone typically, as opposed to a solid state. However, I don't know. I'm a fan of solid state amps personally. I know we've kind of danced around the different varieties, but I mean, for just sitting at home, I'm very inclined to look into a digital amp because there's no gigging involved, and I can just get the perfect tone that I want, and I can just play along, or it doesn't matter because I'm not performing for anybody, and it's more for fun. But when it comes to actually playing, I would still rely probably on solid state amp, and to kind of tie that into the amp that I currently have, I have a Crate FTX 30, which is a 30-watt Crate amp, which when our high school band had wrapped up and I didn't need a 90-watt Fender Princeton, I think it was the Princeton Deluxe 90 or something like that. I wound up trading that in and getting this 30-watt amp, but this particular Crate has a row of a dozen different effects built in. And I was like, oh, great. It's going to be a smaller amp. I can just have all my electronic, effects built right in. I can choose, just things on the fly. And it's my main amp I've had for, has it already been 17 years already?
Oh, yeah.
It's like 2006, I think I bought it at Guitar Center. But it's just versatile enough, and I'm not playing gigs, so I don't need a lot of amp to just play it around the house. I mean, when we were playing shows and we were playing outside or on stages or whatnot, a bigger amp was great, and there was a need for that. But we're not doing that right now. Haven't. I've obviously transitioned far more into drums than guitar, and so more than happy just to have a 30-watt amp to get the job done, and it can be loud enough. It can compete with your Fender amp. So
I can vouch for that because I played through that Crate amp.
Yeah. It's nice to have, but certainly not really one I use too often. But just to talk about some of the features of that amp, so it has a clean channel, and it has the effects channel, and then there's a distortion overdrive switch. You can add heavier distortion with it. Now I still have some guitar effect pedals that I can just add on, but all in one package 30-watt amp, this Crate is awesome. So that's what I wound up sticking with. But speaking of amps, the Marshall amp that our friend Justin refurbished is now my Marshall amp.
Oh,
so the Les Paul sounds wonderful through that particular Marshall amp.
Nice. So
that's now in the arsenal of amps in this particular house. So that one just another, I believe that one's solid state Marshall amp. No frills, just straight channel, and it doesn't need any effects built. It just clean, and then you just turn the gain up just a smidge, and it has enough bite to it that there's no added effects needed. It is gorgeous sounding. So, but again, that's Marshall, right? Like, has a good reputation for doing that, and cliche with
history.
Slash with his Marshall amps and a Les Paul. So it is what it is. So that's my rambling of various amp things.
I like it.
Nice.
But you make a good point. If there's no sense in having, a big rig of amps if you're not. Unless you're going to be experimenting with different types of amps and tonalities, it's a different story. But if you're just a regular guitar player or a regular musician that is not actively gigging but wants to pick up a guitar here and there, something small is very. It's utilized.
It doesn't take up a lot of storage space.
Exactly.
It doesn't need to be crazy loud. And heck, you can even put headphones in and play along and not make a heck of a lot of noise to, wake up the rest of your family or whatnot.
Yep.
So, it's nice. It's cool. You got a big amp sitting in the house. It's like, yeah, look at that. I'm, rock star status. But at the same time, speaking of amps, Kayla, your double head stacked next to you is like borderline gigging rig over there.
Well, there's a reason that they're stacked. It's not that I'm actually using.
Kayla's on tour right now. That's why.
Yeah, on tour of my basement. Basement 2021. Yeah, no. So, if you're not watching the video version, I have behind me a 1962 Fender Bandmaster head, and below that I have an Ampeg B25, which I really don't know much about. I don't even know how I acquired this, to be honest. I think somebody my dad worked with might have given it to him, or he bought it from him or something, and the Bandmaster needs some servicing, and the Ampeg really probably should be serviced as well, but it's not overheating in the way that the Bandmaster is, so I'm a little less worried about it. But so for this show, I didn't really prepare as much to talk about my specific amps as much as I did for maybe the people that are listening that are not guitar players, more of a breakdown of the difference between tube and solid state amps. But obviously I'll talk a little bit about these amps as I go through. We've covered, a little bit of what I had in my notes throughout both Matt and Ted's talks about their amplifiers, but if you're not familiar with how a tube amp works, it runs on vacuum tubes, and sometimes tubes are called valves depending on the type of amp you're talking about. So particularly with British amps such as Marshall or Vox amplifiers, they'll refer to them as valves. They're the same thing. Whereas solid state amps, they use electronics or transistors to amplify the signal. And so, there's pros and cons to both of them, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But a lot of guitar players tend to prefer tube amps because of that warm sound that Matt described. And interestingly enough, I've been having some conversation with Jack from Jacketto Picks, and recently he brought up trying to describe certain sounds to other guitar players and how you can use terms like, I think his example was the term creamy to describe a distortion sound. And other guitarists might know what you're talking about, but non-guitarists kind of look at you like you have two heads because they don't really know what that means. And so it's so warm. When we use the term warm, what that means is it's a spacious sound with good bass and mid-range response. And this is something you don't
like a velvet robe.
That's
sure.
Yeah. Sure, we'll go with that. A nice creamy mousse. So tubes, like Matt said, they become hot or overloaded, which gives them a nice warm overdrive sound. They can often be more responsive and produce different sounds depending on the playing style of the guitarist, whereas solid state amps don't, and I would imagine probably digital and modeling amps as well, don't really allow for this, and that may be an advantage to you depending on what it is you're trying to do with the amplifier. But because of how tube amps work, they tend to only sound clean when playing softly, but they have that nice overdrive sound when a note's heavily attacked. And so if two different guitar players played the same tube amp, it might sound different depending on the guitar player and how they play. And that applies to anything really beyond just amplifiers. It doesn't matter. Obviously, there is some impact based on the guitar and the wood and the pickups and the strings that you're using and your sound effects and your amps and whatnot. But really, a lot of a guitarist's sound also boils down to that person. Like, Matt and Ted could come play my setup and I could play their setups, and we're not going to sound the same because we're different people and we play differently. And so, I think that's one of the reasons why, even if you buy the same gear as your favorite guitar player, even if you played their same setup, it's not going to be the same. Whereas with these digital amps, these modeling amps, you can actually get a much closer sound to the sounds of your favorite guitarist, which is something that before modeling amps were a thing, that was really very difficult to do, even if you had the same exact equipment as that guitar player. So, just something to keep in mind, and tube amps kind of add to that variety a little bit. And, Matt had mentioned that his tube amp is really loud and you don't have to turn it up very much to get a lot of volume. Well, part of that is because tube amps tend to be louder than their listed wattage. So a 50-watt tube amp is usually much louder than a 50-watt solid state amp. And that means you can still get great tone from a lower wattage amp. There are 100-watt tube amps, I'm sure, out there, but they aren't maybe necessary because with a 40 to 60-watt tube amp, you can still get enough volume to get the job done. I mean, Matt talks about not going past maybe 2 at a jam session. I don't think I've ever gone past 2 or 3 on this amplifier. And you guys, they're the last jam session we had, because we were having trouble balancing after everything had been moved out of Ted's basement for a gig. It was like everybody kept telling me to turn up, and I'm like, I'm at like 1.5 right now, and
don't worry about turned up.
Oh man!
Right. So, it's very interesting because you can get more volume out of less wattage with a tube amp than you can with a solid state amp. But there are downsides to tube amps that we've talked about a little bit. There's the size of them, the cost of maintenance. I mentioned that this Fender amp needs work. The tubes have been overheating, and how do I know that they were overheating versus just because they're hot anyway? Well, I was sitting here playing one night and the wall behind the amp was like flame red, which is not normal. And I leaned over and looked, and it was like I could feel the heat coming off of the thing. So, some people who know a bit more about tube amps than I did, when I posted about this and I was like, hey, I'm not sure what's going on here, they were like, don't turn it back on until you get it serviced because the tubes are getting too much power, they're overheating, you could damage the amp if you continue to play with it. So this amp hasn't been turned on in almost a year because I need to go get it serviced, but I'm sure it's going to cost me a lot of money that I don't have right now to put into getting it fixed. And quite honestly, it's probably a miracle that it hasn't blown up at this point, because it hasn't been serviced. My dad and I restored this in the early 2000s, and it has never been biased. or at least it hasn't been biased since then. And I was actually reading an article when I was working on my notes for the show that says that for every 2 to 3, like if you play 2 to 3 hours a day, you should bias your amp every 6 months. So think about that for a second.
Oh, yeah.
I've had this thing for 20 years and I've never biased it. The fact that it hasn't exploded is just probably luck. What I have had happen, and again, probably just been lucky that this didn't happen previously. Last jam session, I think it was, I plugged in, I'm in the middle of warming up, I'm maybe 30 seconds to a minute into warming up, all of a sudden, boom, I have no audio. I turn around and look, and the only reason I knew it wasn't a tube was because the red power light was off. The fuse had blown. I'd never had to replace a fuse in the thing, so I didn't carry spares with me. Now, I used to play this thing at gigs, and the fact that I didn't have any of these things happen during a gig is just, again, a miracle because I didn't have spare parts with me. So, I mean, tube amps, while they sound nice, they are. Yeah, you could totally
walk around with a repair kit just in case.
Yep.
Or a tech. Unless you have a tech who travels with you, it's really kind of you run the risk of your amp could have something go wrong, and there's a lot of things that could go wrong. The tubes are made of glass. You could break a tube transporting it. That's always something I'm nervous about when I transport my amp. I don't carry spares, and I forget if it's preamp or power tubes, but one of the two of them, if you have to replace it, you're supposed to bias the amp after you do that. And so it's not like if a tube went at a show, you could just pull the tube, put another one in, and you're back in business. I mean, there's stuff that has to be done with it. And so I'm not going to get into preamp versus power tubes, cathodes, anodes, biasing, any of that stuff really, because that goes into a much deeper talk. But just know
we'll have a guest for that one.
Yeah, because I'm also like, I don't feel like I'm enough of an expert in all of those things to be able to talk at length about that. But just know that those are terms that go with tube amps. And so, solid state amps, smaller.
But
lighter.
small state is smaller. And so all of those things you just described, and granted, I've never owned a tube amp, but all of those things, how careful you need to be. You can't, if something goes, you got to fix it, but you can't just fix it. There's like another thing you got to do. You got to bring it to a.
Right. There's adjustments.
I'm good. Solid state.
Yeah.
I'm just like, I could, I mean, not wanting to dump it down a set of stairs, but like it's electronic, it's transistors. Like I'm not worried about breaking a tube. Like
you can bang it around a bit more.
Yeah. I'm on team solid state right now.
Sure. Yeah.
So.
And again, that is one of the nice things about solid state amps. They can take a bit more of a hit and not necessarily get damaged. They're smaller, they're lighter. If you're playing a lot of gigs, they're easier to transport than having to bring a tube amp with you. Right. I mean, my amp Matt's amp's a combo. Mine is a head with a cabinet, which is basically a box with speakers in it that the head connects to with a speaker cable. And so, I'm sure Matt's amp is heavy as a tube amp, but as a combo amp, it's a little bit smaller and probably still a little bit lighter weight than lugging around a cabinet and a separate head. And the head alone weighs quite a bit. So, if you're somebody who's just playing at home, or even if you're playing gigs and you're looking for something lighter weight, a solid state amp might be for you. Also, Matt and Ted, you both talked, I think, about built-in effects on your amplifiers. That is something I do not have with a tube amp. The only thing I have on my Bandmaster is a vibrato. And if anybody's watching or listening that can give me a good real-world example for where I would use vibrato in my playing, I would be very open to hearing your suggestions, because in all the years I've owned this, other than just doing it as a fun sound effect when I'm noodling around, I haven't found a reason why I would want vibrato on constantly. And it's actually a separate channel, so you actually have to plug into one of the vibrato inputs on the amp in order to utilize that. It's got a switch for it. I don't ever bring it with me because I never use the vibrato. So that's the only thing I have.
Yep. And what Kayla means by switch is she means the foot switch. So foot switch, for amps, a foot switch is nothing more than literally what it is. It's a switch that's
tap it with your foot.
By your foot, and you could change channels with the stomp of your the input.
Right.
So that's what, for those that don't know what she means by, this has a switch, that's a foot switch, and that's it's to differentiate both channels.
Yeah,
Right.
my
Yep.
Fender Deluxe 90 had a foot switch.
A
Had the
reverb?
regular distortion, and then I had the overdrive button
Yep.
side
Okay.
by side.
Yep.
I forgot it had that. That was nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't need that amp. Like I'm happy, but like just the fact of just the switches are nice. You don't
So
have to
the
like
other-
go and maneuver on the amp itself.
The other
Right.
advantage of solid states too is that unlike tubes, where when you turn it on, you have to let the tubes
have to let it
warm
warm
up,
up.
and then you get your sound. But with
Mhm.
solid states, you just turn it on and the sound's right there. You don't have to worry about tones being warm. It's just instantly right there. So that's also another quick advantage too, as far as time management wise. If you need something to jump right into it and have your tones right then and there, the only thing you have to worry about, or the only thing you have to be considerate of, is your volume on your guitar.
I mean, to be clear, though, it doesn't take too much time for a tube amp
Yeah.
to warm
I
up.
mean,
We're
yeah,
not
it doesn't.
talking like minutes.
It takes a couple hours, but it's okay.
but the gig's over by the time it's
Yeah.
warmed up.
Right.
That's
and
why
then
you
is there a
always
cool
get
down
that
time
early.
on the back end of that, or
Yeah, you really should,
Yeah.
especially like if I'm going to take my amp out in the winter and I've just been playing it and it's really hot, I don't necessarily want to immediately go outside with it, and I don't want to leave it in a cold vehicle because again, the tubes are glass. They will break. I'm sure they could break if you went from hot to cold in a short amount of time. But yeah, they do get really hot. So you also have to be careful about placement of it as well. You want to make sure there's enough ventilation wherever the tubes are for them to
cook
get
it.
enough air.
So
So
you could even cook it. It could cook itself if it doesn't have enough ventilation
Right.
as well.
right, which isn't good. Yeah.
So, yeah. Did we mention
all
high
these
maintenance?
things? Did we mention high
Yes.
maintenance?
Yeah,
Have I
they're
sold
super-
anyone on solid state? Like,
yeah. I mean, solid states are definitely great, and the built-in effects, like you guys talked about, are a great thing. For me, I don't have reverb built into my amp, and that's one thing that I would really like to have. And it took me a long time to find an effect pedal that I felt had a realistic sounding reverb sound to it. I tried a lot of different reverb effects and just didn't care for any of them. They sounded too digital and fake. It really actually, my Vox Tone Lab that I talked about in our pedal gear talk is one of the only pedals I've ever owned that's had a realistic sounding reverb to it. And also, as a side note, if you have a solid state amp and you're looking for that tube distortion sound, there may be other distortion pedals out there that run on tubes. I don't know of any offhand, but the Vox, as I mentioned in that gear talk, runs on a tube. So that could be a way for you to still get some of that tube distortion without having a tube amp. But it's I do miss out on some of the effects that people with solid state amps can get built in, because you've already got the circuitry in there, and adding an effect is just another circuit in the grand scheme. So just real quick to kind of wrap, because I know Matt's got to get going here, just kind of other reasons why you may potentially want a solid state over a tube amp. If you're a jazz guitarist, a lot of jazz guitarists don't want distortion. They want a clean sound. So they're going to probably not want a tube amp, because unless you're playing real light, you're going to always have that little bit of distortion to your sound. It's not going to be totally clean. A lot of jazz guitarists like the Roland JC or Jazz Chorus 120. It's a pretty popular jazz amp. Also, there are rock musicians that preferred solid state amp. Dimebag Darrell played Randall amps because he liked that harsh buzzy tone that he got from them. Andy Summers from The Police played a Roland JC 120. John Fogerty from Creedence Clearwater Revival had a custom solid state amp. And then interestingly enough, Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead, and I was reading about this when I was working on my notes, he took kind of a different approach. He used tube amps for a clean sound and a Fender 85 for distortion, which is kind of the opposite of what most people would do, because they want that warm tube distortion. They would use the tube amp for the distortion and the Fender for the clean. So he kind of did that the other way around, which was interesting. So, really what it all boils down to is what your need for the amplifier is, and what your situation is, and what you like the sound of, and what you can afford, because tube amps, bigger, heavier, more maintenance, but they have
expensive.
nice sound.
I would say I can totally understand like tube amps, especially around the house. If you're just going to set it up and you're not carrying it, and you can, I don't know, if you, that's a tone that you want. Like, I feel like just general gigging and lower maintenance makes sense for solid state. Obviously, we've talked about that But for myself as someone that wouldn't necessarily travel or gig guitar, not out of the realm of possibility of maybe perhaps getting a tube amp, because I can set it. I don't have to worry about like temperature changes leaving the gig or all of those things. If it's going to just sit there, if it needs maintenance, fine. You can just take it to get maintenance. But it is, for me, the way I look at that, I just kind of like set it and play with it for a while.
Set it and forget it. Yeah.
State. I would love to try. I mean, that's what I've been traveling with for a while.
But then there's also the hybrids, which we didn't really talk about because I don't know about you guys, but I don't really have any experience with hybrids, so I can't talk about it. But that's, I guess, kind of the best of both worlds because you're getting a tube amp and a solid state amp. And I know Vox Laney Line 6 has the Flextone 60 and the Spider Valve 212, and PV has the Classic VT series. Those are all hybrid amps. So maybe you want kind of the mix of both. Maybe that's a potential option.
And at that rate, you're looking for a custom sound, right? So,
ladies and gentlemen, I actually have to get going.
Okay.
All right. Listeners,
we're going to wrap on hybrid amps briefly, but thanks for joining us.
Yes.
Thanks for joining.
We'll see you next time, Matt.
Oh, crap. It didn't work this time. Let's do it again.
There we go.
There we go.
And
all right.
He's stepped away.
Yes, Matt's gone.
So just to finish my thought, I mean, I feel like as a guitar player, you're looking for a sound. You've perhaps tried different things over the years, and you have a tone in mind, which is where you start looking for, the amp that'll, and to quote Tom Segura, the amp that'll suit my needs. But again, it just takes trying different things, and sure, going to Guitar Center is great. You get to plug into a bunch of different amps all at once, try different things, but I don't know. I don't like to play too loud in front of too many people because I'm not a good guitar player.
With you. I've never liked to play that loudly at a guitar store.
Then I feel like in a lot of ways you want to turn the amp up and really see where the meat of the sound is, because if you're too low on the range, you're only like sipping a straw worth of sound, and as opposed to just opening the valve up and seeing what it can do.
Different at a gig or something where you're playing much louder than it does playing very low at home.
Well, even the Marshall amp. So the Marshall amp, I had it on 1, and I felt it had the best tone when I turned it up to 5. Yeah. Yep. And
there's a sweet spot.
Yeah. And so it's just a matter of, I don't know, seeking out the tone that you're looking for.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, exactly. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that somebody just starting out runs out and buys,
Marshall
a high-end tube, like a high-end tube amp or anything like that. But, definitely get a feel for what kind of sound you like, and then eventually you can move your way into something that might be more of kind of a permanent rig that you like. For me, I feel you on not wanting to turn up very loud, and even at home when I'm by myself, I don't really, usually my amp's at like maybe 1 or somewhere, and that's not very loud in the grand scheme. So for me, when I go to a jam session, it's a little out of my comfort zone when people are like, you have to turn up, and I'm up to like 2 or 3, and I'm like, guys, this is a lot louder. And I mean, the thing goes to 10 on like the
I bet you that one actually goes to 11.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't literally go to 11, but it goes to 11. If I don't know. I don't think I've ever turned this thing up past 4. So I really don't know how loud. And I mean, something else we didn't talk about either is if you've got a cab, the impact that the speakers have on that as well, because the speakers impact the sound, and I think they do have kind of an effect on your volume. And the cab that I have at Ted's house for jam sessions is way overkill for jam sessions, but
borderline fill like Gillette Stadium with sound out of that thing.
Oh yeah, and I used to haul that thing all over the place for practices and gigs and you name it. And my dad and I were hauling that thing around, and Ted can attest when I brought it over to his house at that last jam session.
It's a two-person job to get it in.
Yeah, it weighs a freaking ton. It's heavy. It's got two, what are the speakers in that thing? I don't know if they're 18-inch or 12-inch, but there's two of them, and it's basically a little bit bigger than a half stack. It's somewhere between a half stack and a full stack, I would say, by the time you're done. And it's heavy. It's overkill, but it has the original JBL D120Fs in it. And when I found that out, I couldn't bring myself to part with it. And I don't have the space for it at home. And it was sitting in a storage unit rotting away. So I was like, hey, Ted.
At least you can use it. And you can plug in and actually get use out of it. Well, when we can play again.
That's my jam session amp that's way overkill for jam sessions.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, Matt was talking about how he could blow people away turning his amp up to 2. Something tells me you guys would have your hair like standing behind you if it faces everybody. So turn it up loud enough and I think you'd have a real Beavis and Butthead moment happening there. But to wrap up, that's just kind of a brief overview of the differences between tube and solid state amps, and then just a little bit of talk on some of those digital interfaces. And really, it boils down to you, if you're a guitar player listening to this, figuring out what kind of sound you like and what piece of equipment works the best for you and your situation. For me, I've had tube amps for a long time, and I really don't use solid state amps these days, and I don't see myself at this point going back to a solid state amp, but it is heavy and it is big and it is fragile and expensive to maintain. So there is certainly an argument to be made for me getting something that's a little bit easier to transport for jam sessions and stuff. But at the same time, I've got this vintage, wonderful sounding amp that to just have it sitting in my basement and play it at home really doesn't make the most sense, and I'm never going to part with it. So it's got sentimental value to me. My dad and I restored it. Aside from it being a high-end vintage amp, it's got that sentimental value. So I play it. I enjoy it. I love this amp. And, find an amp that you love that fits your needs, I think would be the takeaway from this. So hopefully everybody tuning in this week learned a little something about amplifiers. If you've got, a favorite amp, feel free to reach out to us and let us know.
What was the favorite amp you've ever owned or played?
And why?
Well, of course, why?
Yeah. What did you like about it?
Yeah.
Because we'd love to know. Let us know. Reach out to us.
Yeah. And you can always email us at distortedopinionshow@gmail.com.
That's right.
Yes.
Yep. Leave us a voicemail as well.
Yes. I know we have a fun compilation video coming up very shortly, which I don't want to release just yet, but stay tuned to the social medias because it will be premiered on those different avenues. Just some of the highlights, if you will, over the past year as we're closing in our 1 year anniversary episode already. So
believe it or not,
I know time's flying, but either way, reach out to us. Anchor.fm/distorted opinions and leave us a voicemail if you'd like to. Definitely enjoy getting commentary from some of our loyal listeners on that avenue. Already mentioned the email. Reach out to social media, Instagram, YouTube, anywhere our podcast is available. We can definitely find us there. And if you are interested in the YouTube end, hit the subscribe button. We're wanting a custom URL, and we need 100 YouTube subscribers to do that. And we're getting there. Not quite there yet. So subscribe to us on YouTube and keep tabs on the video version of this podcast as well.
That's right.
So did I steal all your spiel or anything else I'm missing?
No, that's okay. No, the only thing I want to do, because I was thinking about this after, and I really should have done this during our international music episode, but I want to give a shout out to our international listeners, because I know we have people in a lot of other countries that are listening to this show. And in particular, I want to shout out to Lee, who's over in England, who has been listening to the show. He's a fellow ham. and we exchange messages through Instagram a lot. And I know he's been supporting us pretty much from the beginning, and recently sent me a message and said that he feels like he probably gets some funny looks when he's listening to our show because he'll be laughing when we're talking about certain things. And I know how that goes because I always feel like I'm a little bit insane if I'm driving somewhere and I'm laughing about something on the radio or whatever. But yeah, just we appreciate all the support both here in the US locally and also those who are listening to us in other countries. And keep up the support. We really appreciate it. And let your friends know if you're enjoying the show, because hopefully we have something for everyone here, and hopefully it seems like we have a good time, and that kind of carries over to people listening to the show and enjoying it. But I just wanted to do that quick shout out because, again, I really the ideal time to do that would have been our international music episode.
Well,
but
it's going to probably be a multi-part. This, like, I don't know,
sure.
The way we did it, it's just scratching the surface on.
We got a lot of multi-part. A lot of things
I know.
that we could
we got a whole nother year ahead of us.
I know.
We got lots of time. We can keep these going.
That's right. So yeah, I think, Ted, you pretty much covered the rest of it. So with that, I think we're good to wrap this show up here. And thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week with whatever our next topic is. I'm not really sure offhand what we're going to be talking about, but I'm sure it's going to be good. So be sure to join us then.